She could feel his gaze burning into her from the top of the grand staircase, his knuckles white as he gripped the mahogany banister. Elizabeth Harrison stood in the center of their tastefully decorated living room, surrounded by Boston's elite, flashing that enchanting smile he had meticulously taught her to perfect. Every tilt of her head, every well-placed word, every graceful gesture, all had been rehearsed over the years as part of their flawless presentation as the ideal family. But tonight something had shifted. Her gaze lingered too long on details. Her eyes didn't waver during veiled confrontations, and most dangerously of all, she had stopped asking for permission. The Harrison family represented the gold standard of Massachusetts society, a dynasty built on traditional values, conservative principles, and business acumen. The patriarch, William Harrison, had established a network of prestigious private academies across New England, promoting elite education founded on discipline and excellence. His eldest son, Richard, had followed in his footsteps, shouldering the burden of maintaining the family's unblemished reputation. Married to Elizabeth for 7 years and father to 2 young children, Richard cultivated the image of a loving father and exemplary businessman. In public, Elizabeth was unfailingly gracious, elegant, and engaged. Behind closed doors, she lived under rigid rules, complete financial control, and a subtle system of emotional punishments should she deviate from the expected script, until one seemingly trivial detail changed everything. During a gala dinner, hosted by the Boston Chamber of Commerce, Elizabeth was approached by Jessica Monroe, a former college roommate now working as an investigative journalist. Their conversation was brief but intense. That same night, Elizabeth accessed an encrypted email Jessica had sent, containing information about quietly settled lawsuits involving the Harrison academies, along with allegations from teachers who had been dismissed after exposing irregularities in both educational practices and financial management. In the days that followed, Elizabeth began paying closer attention to the documents she signed without reading, the contracts Richard asked her to take to the notary, and his discreet meetings with political representatives. The transformation began subtly. Elizabeth reconnected with people Richard disapproved of. She returned to the psychology practice she had abandoned years earlier. There, she found not only support, but allies. One of the psychologists, Dr. Sarah Cooper, specialized in family mediation and collaborated with a support network for women in situations of extreme control. After hearing Elizabeth's account, she understood that despite the absence of physical aggression, what Elizabeth was experiencing was a sophisticated form of emotional imprisonment. "It's like living in a beautiful cage," Elizabeth whispered during her 3rd session, her voice barely audible. "Everyone envies my life, but no one sees the invisible bars." Dr. Cooper nodded slowly. "The most effective prisons are the ones where the captives don't even realize they're trapped. Tell me, Elizabeth, when was the last time you made a decision?" Without wondering what Richard would think, Elizabeth couldn't answer. She couldn't remember. The Harrison mansion in Beacon Hill stood as a monument to old money and refined taste. That evening, as Elizabeth prepared for another charity event, she studied her reflection in the antique vanity mirror. The woman staring back at her wore a designer dress that Richard had selected, jewelry he had approved, and a hairstyle he deemed appropriate for the occasion. "Are you almost ready?" Richard appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. "The Whitcombs are already downstairs." "Just finishing up," Elizabeth replied, applying a final touch of lipstick. "I spoke with Dr. Cooper today. I've scheduled another appointment for next week." Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I thought we agreed that therapy wasn't necessary anymore. You're doing so well." "I find it helpful," Elizabeth said simply, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "It's important to me." The flash of something, surprise perhaps, crossed Richard's face before he regained his composure. "We'll discuss this later. The guests are waiting." With guidance from Dr. Cooper and the support group, Elizabeth began keeping an encrypted diary, documenting Richard's movements, his access to accounts, his hidden routines. She discovered a parallel bank account opened in the name of a shell company, that received monthly transfers from a non-profit sponsored by the Harrison Academies. Her discreet investigation revealed the indirect financing of 2 city council members' election campaigns, both staunch defenders of private education sector interests. Meanwhile, Richard noticed subtle changes in his wife's behavior. He attempted to reverse the situation with expensive gifts, spontaneous trips, and public praise. But Elizabeth was no longer impressed. She maintained her smile, but her eyes now sought something else: escape, justice, freedom. When Richard tried to prevent her from attending a meeting with Dr. Cooper, she confronted him for the first time without raising her voice, without becoming agitated. She simply stated that he didn't have that right, and in that moment he knew he had lost control. "You seem distracted lately," William Harrison remarked to his son during their weekly lunch at the Boston Harbor Hotel. At 72, the elder Harrison maintained the commanding presence that had built his educational empire. "Everything all right at home?" Richard swirled the scotch in his glass. "Elizabeth has been different, distant." "Women go through phases," William dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Your mother had her moments too. Nothing a good vacation couldn't fix." "I don't think it's that simple this time." Richard hesitated. "She's been asking questions about the Westbrook campaign donation." William's eyes narrowed. "Why would she concern herself with that?" "She mentioned something about Jessica Monroe." "The journalist?" William set his glass down carefully. "I wouldn't worry too much. Elizabeth knows what's at stake. The Harrison name means something in this city. She wouldn't risk her children's future over idle gossip." But as Richard watched his father signal for the check, he wasn't so certain. The Elizabeth he had married, compliant, deferential, grateful, was fading away. In her place was a woman he barely recognized, one whose smile no longer reached her eyes. At home that evening, Elizabeth sat in the children's playroom, watching her 5-year-old daughter Sophia build an elaborate block tower, while 3-year-old James crashed toy cars nearby. These quiet moments were her sanctuary. "Mommy, look. How tall?" Sophia exclaimed as she carefully placed another block. "It's wonderful, sweetheart." Elizabeth smiled genuinely. "You're building it so carefully." "Daddy says I need to be more careful with my things," Sophia said, her small brow furrowing. "He says I'm too messy." Elizabeth felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. "Everyone's messy sometimes, Sophia. That's how we learn." She heard the front door open and close, Richard returning from his meeting. Her phone vibrated with a text from Jessica. "Found something about Ridgeview Academy. Call me." Elizabeth quickly deleted the message just as Richard appeared in the doorway. "Quite the domestic scene," he commented with an approving smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. Perhaps you're right about the therapy. If it's helping you, then I support it." Elizabeth knew this pattern well, the concession followed by the reassertion of control. "Thank you," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "I appreciate that." Later that night, as Richard slept, Elizabeth slipped out of bed and padded silently to her private study. From a hidden folder in her laptop, she retrieved Jessica's latest findings: financial statements showing irregular patterns of donations, property acquisitions through subsidiary companies, and a list of teachers who had left the Harrison Academies under unusual circumstances. As she scrolled through the documents, a chill ran down her spine. The empire Richard and his father had built was founded on more than just educational excellence. It was a web of influence, manipulation, and power, and she had been an unwitting part of it all. Elizabeth closed her laptop and stared out at the Boston skyline glittering in the distance. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she made her own choices, spoke her own truth, and no longer feared the consequences of displeasing the Harrison men. The path ahead would be difficult, perhaps even dangerous, but as she returned to bed and lay beside the man who had orchestrated her every move for 7 years, Elizabeth made a silent promise to herself. She would never ask for permission again. The clandestine meeting with Jessica took place at a small coffee shop in Cambridge, far from the social circles where the Harrison name carried weight. Elizabeth arrived early, choosing a secluded corner table and keeping her designer sunglasses on despite the dimly lit interior. "You look like you're in a spy movie," Jessica commented as she slid into the seat across from Elizabeth, her journalist's notebook already in hand. "In my world, this might as well be espionage," Elizabeth replied, removing her sunglasses and glancing nervously around the cafe. "If Richard knew I was here." "But he doesn't," Jessica said firmly. "And he won't, I've been careful." She pushed a manila envelope across the table. "These are copies of testimonials from 3 former Harrison Academy teachers. They were let go after questioning certain accounting practices related to the school's scholarship program." Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she took the envelope. "How bad is it?" "It's not just about creative bookkeeping." Jessica leaned forward, lowering her voice. "The Harrisons have been systematically diverting funds intended for underprivileged students. They've created a complex system that looks charitable on paper, but channels money back to their own interests." "That can't be true," Elizabeth whispered, though a part of her recognized the pattern all too well. Richard's obsessive need for control extended far beyond their marriage. "What interests?" "Political, mostly. Your father-in-law believes education policy should favor private institutions. He's been quietly funding campaigns of politicians who support his vision, using the Academy's charitable foundation as a conduit." Elizabeth thought of the documents she'd signed over the years, the board meetings where she sat silently as the token supportive wife, the charity galas where she smiled for photographs while huge donations were announced with great fanfare. Had she been complicit all along? "I need time to process this," Elizabeth said, tucking the envelope into her designer handbag, "and I need more evidence before I can believe any of it." Jessica nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need, but be careful, Elizabeth. The Harrisons didn't build their dynasty by playing fair." Back at home, Elizabeth sat in her car in the driveway for several minutes, gathering her composure before facing Richard. The mansion loomed before her, its Georgian architecture a testament to old money and established power. Once, she had felt honored to be welcomed into this world. Now the grand house felt more like an elegant prison. "There you are," Richard's voice greeted her as she entered the foyer. He emerged from his study, drink in hand, his expression pleasantly neutral, but his eyes sharp with assessment. "Shopping trip successful?" "Just running errands," Elizabeth replied, keeping her tone light as she set her bag down on the console table. "Sophia's dance recital costume needed alterations." The lie came easily after years of practice. "I thought we agreed Maria would handle those things," Richard commented, referring to their housekeeper. "You have the charity luncheon tomorrow. You should be resting." "I wanted to do it myself. It's important to me to be involved in Sophia's activities." Elizabeth moved toward the staircase, eager to escape his scrutiny. "I'm going to check on the children." "Elizabeth." His voice stopped her on the first step. "I've noticed you've been different lately. Is there something we should discuss?" She turned, maintaining her carefully composed expression. "Different how?" "Distracted, less present." He approached, setting his drink down and taking her hands in his. "I'm concerned about you. Perhaps we should reconsider your therapy sessions. They seem to be stirring things up rather than helping." "Dr. Cooper is excellent at her job," Elizabeth replied, gently but firmly pulling her hands away. "The sessions are helping me gain perspective." "Perspective on what, exactly?" Richard's tone remained concerned, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Our marriage? Your role in this family?" "On myself," Elizabeth said simply. "I've lost sight of who I am over the years. I'm trying to find that person again." Richard studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I understand. We all need self-reflection sometimes. Just remember that everything I've done, everything my father has built, has been for this family, for our future, for the children." As she continued up the stairs, Elizabeth felt his gaze following her. The weight of his expectations, his control, pressed against her back like physical hands. In the safety of her dressing room, she removed Jessica's envelope from her purse and slipped it between the pages of a fashion magazine, the one place she knew Richard would never look. Over the next 2 weeks, Elizabeth methodically built a network of support and gathered information. Each therapy session with Dr. Cooper provided her with new strategies for reclaiming her autonomy. The support group introduced her to women with similar experiences, wealthy, privileged women whose gilded cages were invisible to the outside world. Financial control is often the most effective form of domination, explained Lauren, a divorce attorney who volunteered with the support network. Do you have access to your own money? Accounts in your name only? Elizabeth shook her head. Everything is joint and Richard reviews all the statements. My trust fund from my parents is managed by the same financial advisor who handles the Harrison investments. That needs to change immediately, Lauren advised. We need to establish your financial independence without raising red flags. With Lauren's guidance, Elizabeth opened a new account at a bank the Harrisons never used, explaining to the manager that she was setting up a surprise anniversary gift for her husband. She began transferring small amounts from her personal allowance, sums too insignificant for Richard to notice missing. Meanwhile, she carefully documented the evidence Jessica continued to provide, internal memos detailing how scholarship funds were rerouted through the Harrison Foundation, testimonials from former administrators who had been silenced with generous severance packages and non-disclosure, agreements, financial records showing donations to political campaigns disguised as consulting fees. One evening, as Richard worked late, Elizabeth used his forgotten tablet to access his email. His password, Sophia's birth date followed by his Harvard graduation year, was pathetically easy to guess for someone who had studied his patterns as closely as she had. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. Correspondence with state officials regarding upcoming education policy changes, communications with attorneys about potential containment strategies for disgruntled former employees, discussions with his father about leveraging their connections to secure favorable regulatory decisions. As she scrolled through the emails, one name appeared repeatedly: Senator Thomas Bradford. The senior senator from Massachusetts seemed deeply involved in the Harrisons' affairs, frequently meeting with William and Richard behind closed doors. Elizabeth took screenshots of the most incriminating exchanges, her heart pounding as she transferred them to her secure cloud storage account. "Mummy, I can't sleep." Sophia's small voice startled Elizabeth. She quickly locked the tablet and turned to find her daughter standing in the doorway, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. "Bad dreams again, sweetheart?" Elizabeth asked, opening her arms. Sophia nodded, climbing onto her lap. "I dreamed Daddy was angry because I spilled juice on his papers." Elizabeth held her daughter close, a fresh wave of resolve washing over her. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her children were absorbing the toxic atmosphere of control and fear that permeated their home. "Everyone makes mistakes, Sophia," she said softly, stroking her daughter's hair. "Even Daddy, and it's okay." "But Daddy says Harrisons must be perfect," Sophia murmured sleepily against her shoulder. "Harrisons must be good." Elizabeth closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "You are good, my love, just as you are." When Richard returned home later that night, he found Elizabeth in the sitting room, reading a novel, a simple act of leisure she had almost forgotten she enjoyed. "The children are asleep?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Yes, though Sophia had another nightmare." Elizabeth marked her page and set the book aside. "Richard, I'm concerned about the pressure she's feeling. She's only 5. Children need structure and high expectations," Richard replied dismissively. "My father raised me the same way, and I turned out fine." "Did you?" The question slipped out before Elizabeth could stop herself. Richard froze, his expression darkening. "What exactly are you implying?" "Nothing," Elizabeth backtracked, her old self-preservation instincts kicking in. "I'm just worried about Sophia. She's so sensitive." Richard's posture relaxed slightly. "She'll toughen up." "The world isn't kind to the sensitive, Elizabeth. We're preparing her for reality." As he turned to pour himself a drink, Elizabeth studied the man she had married. Handsome, successful, respected, and utterly incapable of recognizing the damage his preparation was inflicting. Had he been damaged in the same way by William? Was there a cycle of control being perpetuated through generations? "I've been thinking," Richard said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "We should plan a family vacation. The Hamptons, perhaps. Just the 4 of us. away from all distractions. "That sounds lovely," Elizabeth replied automatically, even as alarm bells rang in her mind. Richard's family vacations were always strategic, isolated locations, limited outside contact, complete control over the schedule. It was his favorite method of reasserting dominance when he sensed her pulling away. "I'll have my assistant make the arrangements," he continued. "For next week, I can move some meetings around." "Next week?" Elizabeth kept her voice casual. "That's rather sudden. Sophia has her dance recital and I have the hospital board meeting." "Both can be rescheduled," Richard said firmly. "Family comes first, Elizabeth. You know that." As he sat beside her on the sofa, placing a possessive hand on her knee, Elizabeth realized he was accelerating his timeline. Somehow, he sensed her slipping away and was moving to contain the situation. She would need to accelerate her plans as well. The next morning, while Richard was in the shower, Elizabeth made a quick call to Jessica. "I need everything you have on Senator Bradford," she whispered. "And I need it today." "That's a big ask," Jessica replied. "Bradford is powerful, Elizabeth. Going after him means going public with all of this." "I know. And I'm ready." After ending the call, Elizabeth stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, her eyes clearer, her jaw set with determination. For 7 years, she had been Richard Harrison's perfectly groomed wife, a living accessory to complement his success. Now she was becoming someone else entirely, a woman with secrets of her own, a woman with a plan, a woman who would no longer accept the boundaries others had drawn around her life. As she heard the shower turn off, Elizabeth squared her shoulders. The path ahead would require more courage than she had ever needed before. But for the first time in years, she felt something that had long been absent from her carefully controlled existence: hope. The file on Senator Bradford arrived in Elizabeth's secure email just hours before the family was due to attend a fundraising gala at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. As she scrolled through the documents on her encrypted tablet, her stomach tightened. The connection between the senator and the Harrison family ran deeper than she had imagined, dating back nearly 2 decades, when Bradford was just beginning his political career and William Harrison was expanding his first academy into a network. There were records of consulting fees paid through shell companies, vacation properties jointly owned through LLCs, and most damning of all, evidence that Bradford's son had been accepted to Harvard despite subpar grades and test scores, following a substantial donation from the Harrison Foundation to the university's development fund. "Almost ready?" Richard's voice called from the bedroom. Elizabeth quickly locked her tablet and slipped it into her desk drawer. "Just finishing my makeup," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the turmoil inside her. In the mirror, she applied her lipstick with precision, the ritual calming her racing thoughts. Tonight would be crucial. Senator Bradford would be at the gala, along with several board members from the Harrison Academies. Elizabeth had arranged to meet Jessica discreetly during the event to hand over documents she had collected from Richard's home office, original copies that would validate the electronic evidence they already possessed. The stakes were impossibly high. If Richard discovered what she was doing, she had no doubt he would use every resource at his disposal to destroy her credibility, separate her from her children, and ensure she lost everything. The Harrison reputation for ruthless efficiency wasn't limited to their business dealings. "You look stunning," Richard said appreciatively, as Elizabeth emerged in a midnight blue gown that accentuated her slender figure. 7 years of marriage had taught her exactly how to present herself to please him. Elegant but not attention-seeking, sophisticated but not intimidating, beautiful but in a way that reflected well on his taste rather than her own agency. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the diamond necklace he held out to her, an anniversary gift that had felt more like a collar than a token of affection. As he fastened it around her neck, his fingers lingered against her skin. "Father says Bradford is bringing his wife tonight. Be sure to make her feel welcome. She's still finding her footing in Boston society." "Of course," Elizabeth murmured, mentally noting how Richard always positioned her as a social gatekeeper, reinforcing her role as an extension of Harrison influence rather than an individual. The gala was a glittering affair, with Boston's elite gathered under the museum's soaring glass ceiling. Elizabeth moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her arm linked through Richard's as they greeted benefactors, politicians, and fellow philanthropists. William Harrison held court near the main exhibit, his commanding presence drawing admirers despite his advanced age. "Elizabeth, Richard!" Senator Bradford approached with a champagne flute in hand, his smile broad beneath shrewd eyes. "What? A pleasure to see you both." "Senator," Richard shook his hand warmly, "I believe you know my wife." "Indeed." Bradford took Elizabeth's extended hand, his grip lingering a moment too long. "One of Boston's most gracious hostesses. My wife speaks highly of your charity work." "That's very kind," Elizabeth replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. "How is the Education Committee work progressing? Richard mentions it frequently." A flash of surprise crossed Bradford's face at her direct question about his professional responsibilities, something she had been carefully trained never to do in social settings. "Quite well," he recovered quickly. "In fact, your father-in-law's input has been invaluable on our latest initiative." "I'm sure it has," Elizabeth said, pleasantly. "The Harrisons have always had a unique perspective on educational policy." Richard's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her waist, a warning. "Elizabeth has been passionate about expanding access to quality education," he interjected smoothly. "Perhaps she could join one of your wife's committees." "I have my own initiatives in mind, actually," Elizabeth countered, the subtle rebellion sending a ripple of tension between them that Bradford clearly sensed but couldn't quite interpret. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I should check on the silent auction items we donated." As she glided away, Elizabeth felt Richard's gaze burning into her back. She had deviated from the script, a small rebellion, but in their world of rigid expectations, it registered as a seismic shift. She made her way to the East Gallery, where fewer guests lingered among ancient artifacts. Jessica waited by a Greek sculpture, pretending to study its information plaque. "You're taking a huge risk," Jessica murmured, as Elizabeth stopped beside her, both women facing the artwork rather than each other. "We both are," Elizabeth replied, discreetly slipping a small USB drive into Jessica's evening clutch. "It's all their original documents from Richard's private safe, banking records, correspondence with Bradford dating back to his first campaign." "Are you sure about this, Elizabeth? Once we publish, there's no going back. The Harrisons will know exactly where the information came from." "I'm past the point of no return already," Elizabeth said, a strange calm settling over her. "I've secured an apartment under a different name. I have funds they can't trace. Lauren has the divorce papers ready to file the moment your story breaks." Jessica nodded, her journalist's determination visible in her squared shoulders. 3 days. That's how long it will take us to verify everything and prepare the exposé. Can you maintain normalcy until then?" "I've been maintaining normalcy for 7 years," Elizabeth replied with a bitter smile. 3 more days is nothing." As she rejoined the party, Elizabeth caught sight of William Harrison watching her from across the room, his eyes narrowed, with suspicion. Unlike Richard, who dismissed her as decorative and non-threatening, the elder Harrison had always regarded her with cautious assessment. He had built his empire by recognizing potential threats before they materialized, and something in his expression told Elizabeth that her time was running out. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of superficial conversations and strategic socializing. Elizabeth played her role flawlessly, yet she could feel Richard's growing unease with each interaction. The drive home was filled with tense silence until Richard finally spoke. "What was that about with Bradford?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. "I was being polite," Elizabeth replied, gazing out the car window at the passing city lights. "I thought that's what you wanted." "You know exactly what I mean, Elizabeth. The comment about our unique perspective on education policy." "Since when do you have opinions on my father's business?" "Since I became a mother concerned about the educational system my children will navigate," she countered, turning to face him. "Is it so strange that I might actually care about something beyond hosting dinner parties?" Richard's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. You've been different since you started seeing that therapist. More defiant. I prefer self-aware, Elizabeth said calmly. Dr. Cooper has helped me recognize patterns in my life that aren't healthy. Patterns? Richard's laugh held no humor. And I suppose our marriage is one of these unhealthy patterns. Our marriage is whatever we choose to make it, Richard. But it needs to be a choice we both make, not just your vision that I'm expected to fulfill. The car pulled into their driveway, the security gates closing behind them with an ominous finality. Richard shut off the engine but made no move to exit the vehicle. Is that what you think? That I forced you into some kind of subservient role? His voice had taken on the dangerously quiet tone that usually preceded his most effective emotional manipulations. You came from nothing, Elizabeth, a middle-class family with good intentions, but no connections, no real prospects. I gave you everything. This lifestyle, social standing, access to circles your parents couldn't have dreamed of entering, and now you're concerned about my family's business practices. The naked contempt in his voice stripped away any illusion Elizabeth might have maintained about their relationship. This was the real Richard Harrison, the man who viewed her not as a partner, but as an acquisition, an investment that was expected to yield returns in the form of social enhancement and unquestioning loyalty. Thank you for clarifying exactly how you see me, Elizabeth said quietly, opening her car door. It's very illuminating. Inside the house, she went directly to check on the children, finding them peacefully asleep under the watchful eye of their nanny, Ms. Chen. They were perfect angels tonight, Ms. Chen reported with a warm smile. James asked for an extra story, but otherwise no problems. Thank you, Lisa, Elizabeth replied, genuine gratitude in her voice. Ms. Chen had been her silent ally in recent months, never questioning when Elizabeth asked her to work extra hours or took her into confidence about certain aspects of the children's care. I have a favor to ask. Could you pack overnight bags for the children and yourself? Just the essentials, nothing obvious. Understanding immediately flickered in the nanny's eyes. She had worked for enough wealthy families to recognize the signs of trouble. Of course, Mrs. Harrison. When? 3 days from now. I'll text you the details. Elizabeth kissed her sleeping children, lingering a moment longer than usual. They would be the ones most affected by what was coming, caught in the crossfire of adult decisions and consequences. Yet staying in this environment of control and corruption would damage them in ways far more insidious than the temporary disruption of their routines. The next morning brought a surprise visitor to the Harrison household. Elizabeth was reviewing correspondence in her study when the housekeeper announced that William Harrison had arrived. Elizabeth, the family patriarch entered without waiting for her invitation, his imposing figure filling the doorway. Despite his age, he moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding any room he entered. "And what a pleasant surprise," Elizabeth said, rising from her desk with practiced poise. "Richard didn't mention you were coming by." "This isn't a visit Richard is aware of," William replied, settling into a chair without being asked. "I thought we should have a private conversation." Elizabeth's pulse quickened, but she maintained her composed expression as she sat across from him. "What about?" "Let's not play games," William said, his voice surprisingly gentle despite the steel in his eyes. "I've been watching you, Elizabeth. You're planning something." "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied evenly. "You've been meeting with Jessica Monroe, a journalist, known for her exposés on corporate influence in politics. You've been accessing files in Richard's office. You've been speaking with Lauren Donovan, who specializes in high-profile divorces. And most tellingly, you've been liquidating personal assets and transferring funds to an account you think we don't know about." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face but refused to break eye contact. "How you've been having me followed." "Protecting the family's interests," William corrected mildly. "Something I've been doing since before you were born." He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Elizabeth, I've always respected your intelligence. It's one of the reasons I approved Richard's choice. You're smart enough to understand what you're risking here. Not just your comfortable lifestyle, but access to your children." "Are you threatening to take my children from me?" Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. "I'm reminding you of reality," William replied. The Harrison name carries weight in this city. Judges, police chiefs, social workers, they all send their children to our academies. They serve on committees with us. They benefit from our donations to their causes. In a custody battle, who do you think the system will favor? A Harrison or a vindictive wife making wild accusations? Elizabeth stared at the man who had intimidated her for years with his patriarchal authority and unyielding expectations. In his cold assessment, she suddenly saw Richard 20 years from now. The same calculating eyes, the same absolute certainty of his right to control others. "You know what's remarkable, William," she said finally. "You're so accustomed to bullying people into submission that you've mistaken fear for respect. But fear has a shelf life. Eventually it expires." William's expression hardened. "Is that so?" "Yes." Elizabeth stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "And mine expired the moment I realized what you and Richard are teaching my children. About power and integrity. Whatever happens next, remember this conversation was your choice, not mine." After William left, Elizabeth moved quickly. She called Dr. Cooper, then Jessica, then Lauren. The timeline needed to accelerate. The confrontation with William had confirmed her worst fear. They knew something was happening. They wouldn't wait passively for her next move. That evening, when Richard returned home, Elizabeth was waiting in the living room, her expression calm but resolute. The children were upstairs with Ms. Chen, watching a movie with the volume turned up, a deliberate buffer against what was to come. "My father stopped by today," Richard said without preamble, pouring himself a drink. "He seemed concerned." "I'm sure he did," Elizabeth replied. "He made his concerns quite clear to me as well." Richard studied her over the rim of his glass. And I think it's time we stopped pretending, Richard." Elizabeth met his gaze unflinchingly. "I know about the financial irregularities at the academies. I know about the political payoffs. I know about Bradford. I know everything." For a moment, shock registered on Richard's face before he masked it with a dismissive laugh. "You don't know what you're talking about. Senator Bradford's son's Harvard admission, the shell companies channeling scholarship funds back to the foundation, the teachers who were fired for asking questions, the property deals with council members who approved your zoning changes." Elizabeth listed each item calmly, watching. Richard's expression shifted from dismissal to wary assessment. "Whatever you think you know, you can't prove any of it," he said finally, his voice low. "And even if you could, do you really want to destroy your children's legacy, their future, all for some misguided crusade?" "Their legacy," Elizabeth repeated, incredulously. "Is that what you call it? The legacy of manipulation, corruption, and emotional abuse? That's not a future I want for them, Richard. It's a prison." Richard set down his glass with deliberate care. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its defensive edge, replaced by something far more dangerous, calm, calculated determination. "You've been my wife for 7 years, Elizabeth. You've attended the board meetings, you've signed the documents. You've smiled in the photographs with politicians we've supported. Whatever you think you've discovered, remember this. You're implicated, too." He approached her slowly, his expression almost gentle. "But it doesn't have to be this way. We can start fresh, take that vacation I mentioned, reconnect as a family. You'll see that everything I've done, everything my father built, has been, for us, for a greater purpose." As he reached out to touch her face, Elizabeth stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. In that moment, seeing the practiced manipulation in his eyes, she finally recognized the full extent of her captivity and the true nature of her captor. "I want a divorce, Richard," she said clearly, "and I want full custody of our children." Richard's hand dropped to his side, his expression hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. "That would be a mistake, Elizabeth. One you would regret for the rest of your life." "The only mistake I would regret," she replied steadily, "is teaching my children that this is what love looks like." As they stood facing each other in the elegant living room that had witnessed countless society gatherings, but never a moment of genuine intimacy, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of clarity. The fear that had governed her for years, fear of disappointing Richard, fear of social rejection, fear of failing as the perfect Harrison wife, seemed to evaporate in the heat of her newfound resolve. "You have until tomorrow to consider a reasonable settlement," she continued, her voice stronger with each word. "After that, I file for divorce, and Jessica Monroe publishes her investigation into the Harrison Academy's financial practices. Your choice, Richard." As she turned to leave the room, Richard's voice stopped her. "You won't win this, Elizabeth. No one takes on the Harrison family and walks away unscathed." She paused in the doorway, looking back at the man she had once believed would give her security and happiness. "That's where you're wrong, Richard. I've already won, because for the first time since I met you, I'm making my own choices, and I'm not asking for permission." Upstairs, she found the children still engrossed in their movie, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift occurring in their carefully ordered world. Elizabeth sat beside them on the plush carpet, savoring their warmth and innocence as they leaned against her. Whatever came next would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The Harrisons would use every resource at their disposal to maintain their power and reputation. But as Sophia looked up at her with trusting eyes, Elizabeth silently renewed her promise. She would break the cycle of control, whatever the cost. The battle for her freedom and her children's future had officially begun. The morning Elizabeth's divorce filing hit the Boston courts, she was already settled in a secure apartment in Cambridge with the children and Ms. Chen. Lauren had orchestrated everything with military precision, the paperwork filed electronically at 8 a.m. sharp, the children, coincidentally, on an approved outing with their nanny, and Elizabeth's most important personal items relocated gradually over the previous 2 days. By the time Richard realized what was happening, Elizabeth had activated the legal shields Lauren had helped her prepare. "They've been served," Lauren Needson confirmed over the phone, her voice crisp and professional. "Both Richard and William, and the restraining order is in place. Richard can't approach you outside of court-supervised visitations with the children." "How did they react?" Elizabeth asked, watching Sophia and James play in the sunlit living room of their temporary home. The apartment, while modest compared to the Harrison mansion, felt more like a home than the cold grandeur she had left behind. "Richard was stunned," Lauren replied with professional detachment. "William, less so. I think he suspected this was coming after your conversation. They've already retained Blackwell and associates." "The sharks," Elizabeth murmured. Blackwell's firm was notorious for scorched-earth divorce tactics that left even wealthy adversaries financially and emotionally devastated. "We expected that. What about Jessica's article?" "It goes live at noon. Every major news outlet in New England has received advance copies. The Globe is running it as their lead story." Elizabeth checked her watch. 2 hours until the Harrison empire began to crumble. "And the children's school has been notified?" "Yes. The headmistress understands the situation. Security has been briefed. No one picks up Sophia or James except you or Miss Chen, and the children will be monitored at all times." After ending the call, Elizabeth sat on the apartment's window seat, watching the Cambridge street below. Students hurried to classes at the nearby university. Couples walked dogs. Delivery trucks made their rounds. Ordinary life continuing despite the personal earthquake reshaping her world. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "This is insanity. Call me immediately. We can fix this." She deleted it without responding. 10 minutes later, another message arrived. "Think about the children, Elizabeth. What you're doing will hurt them most of all." The emotional manipulation was so predictable, it almost made her laugh. 3 years ago, such messages would have sent her into a spiral of guilt and self-doubt. Now they only strengthened her resolve. At precisely noon, Jessica's investigative piece went live. Education empire built on fraud. Harrison Academy's web of political influence and financial misconduct blazed across the Boston Globe's website, accompanied by a photo of William and Richard Harrison at a recent gala. Elizabeth read the meticulously researched article with a strange detachment, as though reading about strangers rather than the family she had been part of for 7 years. Jessica had done thorough work, connecting the diversion of scholarship funds to political donations, exposing the network of shell companies used to hide financial transactions, and revealing the pattern of silencing teachers and administrators who raised concerns. Most damning were the quotes from former Harrison Academy employees, speaking on record about the culture of fear and retribution that pervaded the prestigious schools. By 1 o'clock, Elizabeth's phone was inundated with calls and messages from social acquaintances, board members, and fellow charity patrons, some expressing shock and support, others maintaining careful neutrality, and a few already distancing themselves from the brewing scandal. The Harrison family's social media accounts had gone silent. Their publicist released a terse statement calling the allegations categorically false and promising legal action against the defamatory reporting. At 2 o'clock, Lauren called again. Richard's attorneys have filed an emergency motion for temporary custody, claiming you're mentally unstable and have kidnapped the children. Her voice remained steady, but Elizabeth detected a note of concern. They're alleging that your therapy with Dr. Cooper is evidence of psychiatric issues and that you've been acting erratically. We anticipated this, Elizabeth replied, forcing calm into her voice despite the cold fear gripping her chest. The thought of losing her children, even temporarily, was unbearable. Dr. Cooper has already prepared her statement, confirming my mental stability and documenting Richard's controlling behaviors. Yes, but they've found 3 psychiatrists willing to review your case and suggest that your allegations against the Harrisons stem from paranoid delusions. They're pushing for an emergency hearing tomorrow morning. Elizabeth paced the apartment, mind racing. They're moving faster than we expected. What about the financial evidence? That's our strongest counter. Jessica's article has triggered calls for investigation from 2 state representatives. The Education Board is reviewing the scholarship fund allocations, and we've filed our own motion detailing Richard's financial control as a form of abuse. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Elizabeth checked the security camera feed on her phone before opening the door to admit Jessica, who looked simultaneously exhausted and energized, the way only journalists breaking major stories can. It's chaos out there, Jessica reported, setting down her laptop bag. My editors had calls from the mayor's office, 3 state senators, and the governor's chief of staff, all very concerned about the irresponsible reporting that might damage a respected educational institution. Political pressure, Elizabeth nodded, unsurprised. William's calling in favors. They underestimated public interest, Jessica countered with professional satisfaction. The story's being picked up nationally. Education watchdog groups are demanding investigations. Parents of current Harrison Academy students are organizing emergency meetings. The damage control they're used to won't work this time. Throughout the afternoon, Elizabeth monitored the unfolding drama with growing confidence. The children, thankfully, remained blissfully unaware of the storm surrounding their family name, content with their new adventure in a vacation apartment, with their favorite toys and Miss Chen's familiar presence. At 4 o'clock, Elizabeth received an unexpected call from Meredith Bradford, the senator's wife. Elizabeth? It's Meredith. I hope I'm not intruding. The hesitation in her voice was so unlike her usual confident social persona that Elizabeth was momentarily taken aback. Not at all, Meredith. How are you? Honestly? In complete turmoil. Thomas is beside himself. There are reporters outside our home. Our son is being hounded at his office. She paused. I wanted to know if it's true. Did Richard really treat you the way the articles are suggesting? The question caught Elizabeth off guard. The media coverage had focused primarily on the financial and political aspects of the scandal, with only passing references to the controlling nature of her marriage. Yes, she answered simply. For 7 years. A long silence followed. Then, I suspected as much. The way he watched you at events, the way you always checked with him before answering even simple questions. Meredith's voice grew stronger. Elizabeth, Thomas is planning to deny everything. William has convinced him they can weather this together. But I found documents in our home office. Things Thomas thought I'd never see. I know my husband was involved in what the Harrisons were doing. Meredith, let me finish, please. I've been the good political wife for 22 years. I've looked the other way, hosted the right parties, supported every campaign. But this, using scholarship money meant for underprivileged children to fund political ambitions. I can't stay silent anymore." The implication hung in the air between them. "Are you saying you want to come forward?" Elizabeth asked carefully. "I'm saying I have documentation that confirms your evidence. Banking records, correspondence, meeting notes. Thomas doesn't know I've had copies for years." Elizabeth's mind raced with the potential impact of a senator's wife corroborating the allegations. "Meredith, this would be significant, but the personal cost to you would be considerable," Meredith finished for her. "I know, but watching you take this stand, it's made me realize how long I've been compromising my own integrity. Maybe it's time for both of us to stop asking for permission." By evening, Elizabeth's legal team had incorporated Meredith's evidence into their strategy, strengthening both the divorce case and the broader investigation into the Harrison academies. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for 9 the next morning, with Judge Eleanor Winters presiding, a development that gave Lauren cautious optimism. "Winters is known for her focus on children's well-being above all else," she explained during their final preparation session. "She won't be swayed by the Harrison name or their political connections. If anything, she's historically skeptical of wealthy fathers who suddenly develop passionate interest in daily childcare during divorce proceedings." "Will the children need to appear?" Elizabeth asked, her primary concern unchanged despite the whirlwind of legal and media activity. "No. The judge will likely speak with them in chambers if she feels it's necessary, but at their ages, especially James being only 3, that's unlikely at this stage." Elizabeth nodded, relief washing over her. The thought of her children being subjected to courtroom drama was her greatest fear. As night fell over Cambridge, Elizabeth tucked Sophia and James into bed in their temporary room, reading them an extra story and answering Sophia's increasingly perceptive questions about when they would return home. "We're going to be staying here for a little while, sweetheart," Elizabeth explained gently. "Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure things out." "Is Daddy coming here?" Sophia asked, her small brow furrowed. "Not right now," Elizabeth replied, carefully. "Daddy and I need some time apart to solve some grown-up problems." "Is it because he gets angry a lot?" The innocent question pierced Elizabeth's heart. Even at 5, Sophia had absorbed the tense atmosphere of their household. "Partly," she answered honestly, "but that's not something you need to worry about. My job is to make sure you and James are safe and happy." "I like it here," James contributed sleepily. Ms. Chen made pancakes with faces. Elizabeth smiled, stroking his hair. "She did, didn't she? And tomorrow maybe we can make cookies together." After the children were asleep, Elizabeth sat alone in the apartment's small kitchen, preparing for the battle ahead. Lauren had warned her that Richard would likely attempt to portray her as unstable, greedy or vindictive, the standard playbook for wealthy men facing divorce from wives who dared to challenge them. He would leverage every social connection, call in every favor, and spare no expense to maintain control. But for the first time, Elizabeth felt truly prepared to face him, not just legally, but emotionally. The woman who had once measured her worth by Richard's approval now recognized the strength in her own reflection. Her phone rang, William Harrison's private number. After a moment's hesitation, she answered, "Elizabeth." His voice carried its usual authoritative tone, though perhaps with a new undercurrent of strain. "I think we should talk." "I believe our lawyers are handling communications now, William," she replied evenly. "This situation has escalated unnecessarily," he continued, as though she hadn't spoken. "The damage to the family name, to the academies, to the children's future, it's considerable, but not irreparable. Is that what concerns you, the family name, not the misappropriated scholarship funds or the political corruption? Those are inflammatory characterizations of legitimate business practices," William dismissed. "But I'm not calling to debate semantics. I'm offering a solution." Elizabeth waited silently. "A generous settlement, full financial support for you and the children, a house of your choosing, private education through college for Sophia and James. All we ask is your discretion and cooperation in resolving these misunderstandings about the Academy's operations." "You're offering to buy my silence," Elizabeth translated. "I'm offering a dignified resolution that protects everyone's interests, especially the children's," William corrected smoothly. "Richard is willing to agree to joint custody with generous visitation rights for you." "For me?" Elizabeth couldn't contain a short laugh. "They're my children, William. I'm not the one who needs visitation rights." "Be reasonable, Elizabeth. You've made your point. You've asserted your independence. But prolonging this public spectacle helps no one. Think about what the children will find when they're old enough to search their family name online." It was a calculated blow, aimed precisely at her deepest vulnerabilities as a mother. 3 years ago, it might have worked. Even a year ago, she might have wavered. But now Elizabeth saw the manipulation for exactly what it was. "The children will find that their mother refused to be silenced," she replied steadily, "that she stood up against corruption and control, even when it was difficult. That's a legacy I'm proud to leave them." "This self-righteous crusade will cost you more than you realize," William's voice hardened. "The Harrison family has endured for generations by knowing when to fight and when to make strategic alliances. You're choosing the wrong battle, Elizabeth." "No, William, for the first time I'm choosing the right one." She ended the call, her hand perfectly steady. Across Boston, in the Harrison mansion on Beacon Hill, Richard paced his study, phone clutched in his hand as his father delivered the news of Elizabeth's refusal. "She's not backing down," William reported grimly. "She's convinced herself this is some moral stand." "She'll crumble in court," Richard insisted, though with less conviction than he'd felt that morning. The speed and precision of Elizabeth's actions had caught him off guard. The wife he thought he knew, deferential, grateful, easily managed, had vanished, replaced by a strategic opponent who had apparently been gathering evidence and planning her escape for months. "Blackwell thinks we should focus on her mental state," he continued. "Suggests that she's been influenced by her therapist, maybe even experiencing some kind of breakdown. That angle loses impact when set against the financial evidence," William pointed out sharply. "We need to contain the damage to the academies first. The divorce is secondary." "Secondary?" Richard's voice rose. "She took my children, Father. She ambushed me with lawyers and restraining orders. She's turned my life into a public spectacle." "Keep your voice down," William ordered coldly. "This emotional response is precisely what we can't afford right now. The board is meeting tomorrow morning. The Education Department has requested our scholarship allocation records for the past 5 years. Senator Bradford is distancing himself publicly. These are the priorities." Richard stared at his father, suddenly seeing the old man with new clarity. William. Harrison had built his empire through calculated decisions and strategic sacrifices. Emotional collateral damage meant nothing against the greater goal of preserving the Harrison legacy. Had he always been this cold? This detached from the human cost of his ambitions? And more disturbingly, was this what Elizabeth had seen when she looked at Richard himself? "I want my children back," Richard said finally, his voice low but firm. "Whatever it takes to make that happen." "Then pull yourself together," William advised without sympathy. "Court tomorrow, 9 a.m. Judge Winters doesn't tolerate theatrical displays. Present yourself as the concerned father, focused solely on the children's well-being. Leave the academy business to me and the lawyers." After his father left, Richard remained in his study, surrounded by the trappings of success that had defined his identity for so long. The framed photographs on his desk showed the perfect family he had believed was his by right. Elizabeth elegant and smiling, the children impeccably dressed, everyone playing their assigned roles in the Harrison family narrative. But the woman in those photographs, the carefully curated wife he had selected and molded, had turned out to be someone else entirely, someone with secrets, determination, and a moral compass that operated independently of his approval. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Harrison faced an opponent he couldn't intimidate, buy off, or control. And as he prepared for the battle ahead, a disturbing thought took root in his mind. What if Elizabeth wasn't having a breakdown? What if instead she was finally seeing clearly? The night before the custody hearing, a steady rain fell over Boston, washing the city streets and drumming against the windows of Elizabeth's Cambridge apartment. As she finalized preparations with Lauren, reviewed her statement for the judge, and laid out her clothes for mourning, Elizabeth felt an unexpected sense of peace. Tomorrow would be difficult, perhaps the most challenging day of her life. Richard would be there with his expensive suit and practiced sincerity. William would have marshaled every connection he could reach. The courtroom might be filled with Harrison allies, but none of that could change the fundamental truth that had set her free. She was no longer asking for permission to exist. The woman who would face Judge Winters tomorrow wasn't the same one who had entered the Harrison family 7 years ago, polished, grateful, and painfully eager to please. This Elizabeth carried herself differently. She spoke with quiet conviction, rather than rehearsed charm. Her value wasn't measured by a powerful man's approval, but by her own integrity. And as she checked on her sleeping children one last time before bed, Elizabeth made them a silent promise. The cycle of control that had defined the Harrison dynasty for generations would end with her. Whatever the court decided tomorrow, her children would grow up understanding that love wasn't about power or possession, it was about freedom. The Suffolk County Family Court building stood imposing against the gray morning sky, its granite facade a testament to the enduring power of institutions. Elizabeth arrived 30 minutes early, accompanied by Lauren and Dr. Cooper, who would testify about Richard's controlling behaviors and their impact on Elizabeth's psychological well-being. News vans lined the street, reporters huddled under umbrellas in the light drizzle. The Harrison case had captured public attention not just for its financial revelations, but for its human drama, the story of a woman who had dared to challenge one of Boston's most powerful families. "Remember," Lauren advised as they approached, the private entrance reserved for sensitive cases, "Judge Winters will focus on the children's best interests. Keep your responses centered on their well-being, not on punishing Richard or exposing the Harrisons." "I understand," Elizabeth nodded, smoothing her conservative navy dress. She had chosen her outfit carefully, professional but not extravagant, nothing that could be interpreted as flaunting wealth that came from the Harrison name. Inside the courtroom, Richard was already seated with his legal team, the infamous Theodore Blackwell at his side. William Harrison occupied a seat directly behind them, his expression impassive, but his eyes alert, assessing every detail. When Elizabeth entered, Richard's gaze locked onto her with an intensity that once would have made her shrink into herself, seeking ways to appease his obvious displeasure. Today she met his eyes briefly, then calmly took her seat beside Lauren. Judge Eleanor Winters, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency in family court matters, entered precisely at 9. Her sharp eyes scanned the courtroom, lingering momentarily on William Harrison before focusing on the attorneys. "Let's be clear from the outset," she began after the preliminary introductions. "This court's sole concern is the welfare of the minor children, Sophia and James Harrison. The financial allegations regarding Harrison Academies, while they may provide context, are not the primary focus of today's proceedings." She looked directly at Richard and Elizabeth. "I've reviewed the emergency custody motion filed by Mr. Harrison, as well as Mrs. Harrison's response and supporting documentation. I've also received numerous character references for both parties, which I've given appropriate consideration." The hearing proceeded with a clinical efficiency that belied the emotional undercurrents charging the room. Richard's attorneys presented their case first, painting Elizabeth as a woman whose recent therapy had led to delusional beliefs about her husband's controlling nature, culminating in her impulsive decision to separate the children from their father. "Mrs. Harrison has demonstrated erratic judgment," Blackwell argued smoothly. "She has abruptly removed the children from their home, disrupted their routines, and embarked on a public campaign to demonize their father, actions that can only cause psychological harm to these vulnerable young children." When Lauren rose to present Elizabeth's case, the shift in narrative was stark and compelling. She methodically outlined Richard's pattern of control, financial, social, and emotional, supported by Dr. Cooper's professional assessment and documentation. Most powerfully, she presented a timeline of Elizabeth's careful preparation for the children's transition, demonstrating that far from being impulsive, Her actions had been meticulously planned to minimize trauma. Mrs. Harrison has prioritized stability and emotional safety for these children, Lauren concluded. She has secured appropriate housing, maintained their relationship with their beloved nanny, and ensured continuity in their education. Her actions reflect not instability, but extraordinary care under difficult circumstances. When Elizabeth was called to testify, she felt a surprising calm settle over her. Richard watched from the plaintiff's table, his expression a studied mask of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Harrison," Judge Winters began, "please describe your current living arrangements for the children and how they're adjusting to these changes." "Sophia and James are in a 3-bedroom apartment." "In Cambridge," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady. "Their nanny, Ms. Chen, who has cared for them since James was born, has a room adjacent to theirs. We've maintained their daily routines as much as possible. Sophia continues attending her kindergarten class, though with enhanced security measures that the school has implemented. James still has his morning playgroup 3 times weekly." "And how would you characterize their emotional state during this transition?" "They've shown remarkable resilience," Elizabeth said, allowing a small smile. "Children are perceptive. They knew something was wrong in our home long before I did. Sophia has actually been sleeping through the night for the first time in months. She's no longer afraid of making small mistakes, like spilling her juice or speaking too loudly." "Objection," Blackwell interjected. "Mrs. Harrison is not qualified to make psychological assessments of the children." "I'm not asking for a clinical assessment, Mr. Blackwell," Judge Winters replied firmly. "I'm asking a mother about observable changes in her children's behavior. Please continue, Mrs. Harrison." Elizabeth described the subtle but significant improvements she'd noticed. James no longer flinched at sudden noises. Sophia had stopped anxiously seeking approval for every small decision. Both children laughed more freely. Throughout her testimony, she maintained a dignified composure, never once attacking Richard personally or straying into the broader allegations against the Harrison family. When it was Richard's turn to testify, he projected the image of a devoted father blindsided by his wife's actions. "I've always put my children first," he insisted, his voice carrying just the right note of emotional restraint. "To be separated from them without warning, to learn about it through legal papers rather than a conversation, it's been devastating." Judge Winters observed him carefully. "Mr. Harrison, before these events, approximately how many hours per week did you spend directly caring for your children? Feeding them, bathing them, putting them to bed, taking them to activities, without household staff present?" The question seemed to catch Richard off guard. "I have demanding professional responsibilities," he began. "That's not what I asked," Judge Winters interrupted. "Please answer the specific question." Perhaps 10 to 15 hours weekly," Richard estimated, though his hesitation suggested even this might be an exaggeration. "And Mrs. Harrison, how many hours would you estimate she spent in direct caregiving?" "She has always been a devoted mother," Richard conceded, recognizing the trap too late. "The children are her primary focus." As the testimony continued, Elizabeth noticed a subtle shift in the courtroom atmosphere. Richard's carefully constructed narrative of the concerned father fighting for his children began to unravel under Judge Winters' precise questioning about the details of their daily lives, details he struggled to provide accurately. Who was James's favorite stuffed animal? What size clothes did Sophia currently wear? Which foods did each child refuse to eat? These weren't gotcha questions designed to embarrass. They were the basic knowledge any actively involved parent would possess. During a brief recess, Lauren squeezed Elizabeth's hand. "You're doing perfectly. Stay focused and calm." "Richard seems smaller somehow," Elizabeth observed quietly. It was true. The man whose disapproval had once seemed so crushing, whose anger could fill a room without a word being spoken, appeared diminished in this setting where his name carried less weight than his actual behavior. When the hearing resumed, an unexpected development shifted the dynamics dramatically. Judge Winters announced that Meredith Bradford had submitted a sworn affidavit corroborating Elizabeth's claims about the Harrison family's methods of control and intimidation, having witnessed them firsthand at numerous social and political events. Mrs. Bradford's statement specifically notes instances where she observed Mr. Harrison exercising what she describes as excessive control over Mrs. Harrison's movements, conversations, and decisions, Judge Winters noted, as well as similar patterns in the senior Mr. Harrison's interactions with his daughter-in-law. From the back of the courtroom, Elizabeth caught William Harrison's expression hardening, the first crack in his imperturbable facade. A senator's wife breaking ranks to support Elizabeth represented more than just helpful testimony. It signaled a fracturing of the social alliance William had carefully cultivated for decades. After 4 intense hours, Judge Winters called a lunch recess before delivering her decision. Elizabeth declined Lauren's suggestion to leave the building, not wanting to face the media gauntlet outside. Instead, she found a quiet corner in a conference room reserved for their use, closed her eyes and practiced the breathing techniques Dr. Cooper had taught her. Whatever the outcome, she had spoken her truth. She had stopped pretending. That alone was a victory no court could take from her. When court resumed, Judge Winters wasted no time. Having reviewed all testimony and evidence presented today, I find that the best interests of the children are served by maintaining their current living situation with Mrs. Harrison, with regular visitation rights for Mr. Harrison. She detailed a visitation schedule that would gradually increase as the situation stabilized, with initial visits to be supervised by a court-appointed monitor. Additionally, she continued, given the evidence presented regarding Mr. Harrison's controlling behaviors, I am ordering both parties to participate in co-parenting counseling before any consideration of joint custody can be entertained. Richard's face flushed with barely contained anger as Judge Winters continued outlining her decision. William Harrison sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. When the judge finally adjourned the hearing, Richard leaned over to whisper something to Blackwell, who shook his head firmly in response. Elizabeth gathered her papers slowly, allowing Richard and his entourage to leave first. She had no desire to create a scene or engage in hallway confrontations that might end up on the evening news. "Congratulations," Lauren said quietly. "This is a significant victory." "It's just the beginning," Elizabeth replied, knowing that the Harrison family rarely accepted defeat gracefully. "They'll appeal, won't they?" "Probably, but Judge Winters' reasoning was sound and well documented. An appeal would be difficult." As they prepared to leave through the private exit, a court officer approached with a message. William Harrison had requested a brief private conversation with Elizabeth. Against Lauren's advice, Elizabeth agreed, stipulating that they meet in a conference room with Lauren present, but not participating. William entered alone, having apparently separated from Richard and the legal team. He looked older than he had just hours before, the strain of the day evident in the deepened lines of his face. "That was quite a performance," he said, without preamble, though without his usual commanding tone. "It wasn't a performance," Elizabeth replied simply. They regarded each other across the conference table, adversaries assessing the battlefield. "You've created quite a situation," William finally continued. "The board is calling an emergency meeting. 2 major donors have publicly distanced themselves from the academies. Senator Bradford's office issued a statement this morning announcing an internal review of his connections to educational institutions. Those are consequences of actions taken long before I filed for divorce," Elizabeth pointed out. William nodded slowly, surprising her. "Perhaps, but consequences rarely fall on those most deserving of them." He straightened his tie, a habitual gesture she had seen Richard mimic countless times. "I've lived 72 years building something meaningful, Elizabeth. The Harrison name stands for educational excellence. Thousands of students have benefited from our academies. And how many could have benefited from the scholarship funds that were diverted elsewhere?" Elizabeth asked quietly. For the first time in their relationship, William regarded her not as an accessory to the family, but as a formidable opponent, worthy of honest engagement. "You're not going to stop, are you? The divorce is just the beginning." "I didn't start this, William. I simply refuse to continue enabling it." She met his gaze steadily. "The Harrison Academies could be everything you claim they are, centers of educational excellence, opportunities for deserving students, positive influences in their communities, but not while they're built on corruption and control." William was silent for a long moment. "Richard is my son," he finally said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of something almost like uncertainty. Family loyalty is non-negotiable. Even when that loyalty enables harm? Elizabeth asked. Is that the legacy you truly want to leave? Without answering, William rose from his chair. The children, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Sophia and James, they're innocent in all this. Yes, Elizabeth agreed, which is why I'm fighting to give them something better than what Richard and I had. Something honest. William nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then left without another word. As Elizabeth watched him go, she realized she had just witnessed something remarkable. Not surrender, certainly not approval, but perhaps the first flicker of recognition that the world he had built was not as unassailable as he had believed. The media storm surrounding the Harrison case intensified over the following weeks. Jessica's initial exposé spawned dozens of follow-up investigations by other outlets. The State Education Department launched a formal audit of all Harrison Academy financial records. 2 board members resigned, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. Senator Bradford announced he would not seek re-election, focusing instead on family priorities, a decision coinciding with rumors that Meredith Bradford had consulted divorce attorneys. Richard, under increasing pressure as the acting head of the academies, while William dealt with health issues that conveniently arose during the crisis, launched a comprehensive transparency initiative designed to demonstrate the school's commitment to proper financial management. Elizabeth watched these developments from a distance, focusing her energy on creating stability for the children and rebuilding her own identity beyond Mrs. Richard Harrison. She enrolled in graduate courses in psychology, specializing in family, systems, and emotional abuse recovery. She joined Dr. Cooper in facilitating support groups for women emerging from controlling relationships. And most importantly, she created a home where Sophia and James could express themselves freely, make mistakes without fear, and witness an adult modeling authentic strength rather than power over others. 6 months after the custody hearing, Elizabeth sat across from Richard in a neutral office space, their court-mandated co-parenting counselor, facilitating what had become monthly check-ins on the children's well-being. These sessions, initially tense and combative, had gradually evolved into cautiously functional interactions centered solely on Sophia and James. Sophia's teacher mentioned she's showing real leadership qualities in group projects, Elizabeth reported, consulting her notes from the recent parent-teacher conference. She's particularly good at including quieter classmates. That doesn't surprise me, Richard replied. She's always been socially perceptive. He hesitated, then added, James had fun at the Children's Museum last weekend. He spent almost an hour in the water play area. Elizabeth nodded, noting how these small exchanges about their children had become possible without the power dynamics that once dominated their every interaction. Richard had changed, not dramatically, not completely, but perceptibly. The loss of his carefully constructed world and the public reckoning with his family's legacy had stripped away some of his arrogance. Whether this represented genuine growth or merely adaptive behavior remained to be seen. But for the children's sake, Elizabeth remained cautiously optimistic. As the session concluded, Richard lingered after gathering his papers. There's something you should know, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Father is stepping down as chairman of the board, permanently this time, not just the temporary leave he's been on. I see, Elizabeth replied, waiting for the rest. The board has brought in an independent educational consultant to restructure the academy's governance. There will be parent and teacher representatives moving forward with full voting rights. He met her gaze directly. The scholarship program is being completely redesigned with external oversight. No exceptions, no special arrangements. The unspoken acknowledgement hung between them. You were right. That's positive progress, Elizabeth said simply, for the schools and the students. Richard nodded, then asked the question she sensed had been on his mind for months. Was any of it real, Elizabeth? Us, I mean. Or was it all just survival on your part? The question deserved honest consideration. Elizabeth thought back to their early days, before the control had become suffocating, before she had recognized the patterns she was trapped in. "I think in the beginning there were genuine moments," she finally answered. "But they got lost in something unhealthy, something that wasn't love at all but possession." "I didn't see it that way," Richard said quietly. "I thought I was protecting you, supporting you. By controlling me," Elizabeth pointed out. "By making all my decisions, managing all my relationships, dictating how I dressed and spoke and behaved. By providing structure," he countered, though with less conviction than he once would have. "That's what my father taught me. That's what I thought marriage was supposed to be." Elizabeth considered his words, recognizing the generational pattern that had shaped him just as surely as it had imprisoned her. "That's not love, Richard. That's ownership, and no one thrives being owned." To her surprise, he didn't argue. He simply nodded once, collected his coat, and left with a polite goodbye. As she watched him go, Elizabeth reflected on how far they had both come from that night 6 months ago, when she had finally said no to the life she had been living. The road since then had not been easy. The Harrison family had used every resource at their disposal to fight her, legally, socially, financially. But with each battle, their once formidable power had diminished, eroded by exposure to the sunlight of public scrutiny and Elizabeth's steady refusal to back down or be silenced. 1 year to the day after Elizabeth had left the Harrison mansion, she stood in the sunny kitchen of her new home, a comfortable colonial in a family-friendly Brookline neighborhood, purchased with her own money from the fair divorce settlement Lauren had negotiated. Sophia was setting the table for a special dinner, while James helped Ms. Chen decorate the homemade birthday cake. The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of guests. Jessica and her partner, Dr. Cooper, Lauren and her family, and several women from the support group who had become dear friends. As Elizabeth welcomed them, she caught a glimpse of herself in the entryway mirror and paused, struck by the woman she saw reflected there. This Elizabeth moved differently, spoke differently, carried herself with a quiet confidence that needed no external validation. Her smile reached her eyes. Her laughter came easily. Her opinions were expressed without prefacing qualifiers or anxious glances seeking approval. She had stopped performing and started living. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Elizabeth sat on her back porch with a glass of wine, enjoying the peaceful garden and the distant sound of neighborhood life. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Meredith Bradford, who had indeed divorced the senator and was now running for city council on a platform of educational equity and transparency in public-private partnerships. "Saw the Post piece about the academy reforms. You started something important, never doubt that." Elizabeth smiled, sending back a simple thank you before setting her phone aside. The media had dubbed her the woman who brought down the Harrison dynasty, but that framing missed the point entirely. She hadn't set out to destroy anything, only to free herself and protect her children from a cycle of control that had persisted for generations. If, in the process, corrupt systems were exposed and reformed, that was justice, not vengeance. The Harrison Academies continued operating, though with new leadership and genuine oversight. Richard maintained his relationship with the children, gradually earning back their trust through consistent, respectful behavior rather than intimidation and control. William had retreated from public life, his health genuinely compromised by the stress of the scandal and its aftermath. The mighty Harrison name no longer carried the weight it once had in Boston society, but perhaps that was for the best, for everyone involved. As night fell over her garden, Elizabeth thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, standing at the top of that grand staircase in the Harrison mansion, watching her husband watch her from across the room. That woman had been beautiful, polished, and absolutely trapped. A bird in a gilded cage, singing only the songs she had been taught. Today, her life was messier in some ways. Single motherhood brought challenges. Rebuilding a career required effort. Navigating co-parenting with Richard demanded constant vigilance against old patterns. But it was authentically hers. Each decision, each success, each struggle belonged to her alone. The price of freedom had been high, but its value was beyond measure. Elizabeth finished her wine and went inside, locking the door behind her, not out of fear, but out of the simple security of knowing this space was hers, created on her terms, governed by her values. In the soft light of her home, surrounded by evidence of a life reclaimed, Elizabeth Harrison finally understood the most important lesson of her journey. True power was never about controlling others. It was about refusing to be controlled. And in the quiet of her own heart, in the peace of her own mind, in the laughter of her children who were learning to live without fear, Elizabeth had found something Richard and William Harrison, with all their wealth and influence, had never possessed: the simple, profound freedom of living without asking permission. Years later, on a crisp autumn morning in Boston, Elizabeth stood watching Sophia's debate team competition at her new school, a progressive institution that emphasized critical thinking over rote memorization, collaboration over competition, and character development over social connections. Now 12, Sophia had blossomed into a confident young woman with her mother's quiet strength and a voice entirely her own. 10-year-old James sat beside Elizabeth, sketching in his ever-present notebook, his artistic talents flourishing in an environment that celebrated individual expression. As Sophia delivered her closing arguments with poise and conviction, Elizabeth felt a familiar presence beside her. Richard had arrived quietly, nodding a respectful greeting before focusing on their daughter's performance. Their relationship had evolved into something neither could have imagined during those tumultuous days. Not friendship, certainly not reconciliation, but a functional co-parenting arrangement built on mutual respect for boundaries and shared commitment to their children's well-being. The Harrison Academies had undergone a complete transformation under new leadership, with genuine scholarship, programs that served underprivileged students, and transparent financial practices that became a model for other private educational institutions. William Harrison had passed away the previous year, having lived long enough to see his educational legacy salvaged, though not in the form he had originally envisioned. Elizabeth herself had completed her graduate studies and now directed a support network for women transitioning out of controlling relationships, providing both emotional and practical resources for those taking their first steps toward independence. Her story had inspired countless others to examine their own lives and relationships, to question the cages they had accepted as normal, and to imagine freedoms they had been conditioned to believe were impossible. As Sophia's team was declared, the winner, and James rushed forward to congratulate his sister. Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from that moment at the top of the staircase when she first recognized the false smile she had been trained to wear, to this morning of authentic joy and hard-earned peace. The most profound change wasn't in the external circumstances of her life, though those were certainly different. It wasn't even in the public vindication of her claims about the Harrison family's business practices. The true transformation lived in the quiet certainty that now guided her days, the knowledge that her worth was inherent, not assigned, that her voice mattered not because of who might listen, but because it was hers, that love without freedom was merely possession in disguise. And in that knowledge,